For the last couple of days, I've been playing Avowed non-stop, and after pouring over 40 hours into the game, I'm here to share my impressions on whether it's any good. By the end of this video, you should have a pretty good idea of whether this game is for you or not. Before we dive in, I want to thank Xbox Game Studios for providing me a free copy of the game on Steam for review and content creation purposes. Let's start with the story. Avowed takes place in the same universe as the Pillars of Eternity franchise. Now, I'm not too familiar with this franchise, so I'll be giving a newcomer's perspective on the story I experienced. Obsidian Entertainment, the developers of this game, also made The Outer Worlds, which I played previously and quite enjoyed for its story, and due to that, I went into Avowed with an open mind, hoping for a solid narrative. And for the most part, it delivers. I do my best not to try and spoil the story in my reviews, so I'll keep this part brief. You play as an Adirian envoy who travels to the Living Lands to find a solution to a plague called the Dream Scourge. Throughout your journey, you meet several companions and encounter a variety of NPCs with rich backstories. And that's one thing I have to stress. Avowed is packed with lore. Almost half the time spent in the game is dedicated to dialogue, story, and lore exposition. So if you're not into story-heavy games, this might not be the game for you. Choices are a big part of any story-rich RPG, and this game is no different. However, I found that choices don't have the far-reaching impact I expected. While there are definitely major decisions that affect the story, like who takes power or who dies, but many of the dialogue options feel like forced either-or moments, leaving little room for neutral or gray areas. It was a bit disappointing, as I expected more freedom with my choice. In that sense, it's a bit disappointing as many of the decisions you need to make aren't necessarily decisions I wanted to make. I always thought maybe if I answered in a specific way, I could find neutral moments, and it just wasn't the case. You're essentially forced to make either-or decisions that affected a majority of the story. Same with skill checks, character leveling, and progress, and the origin you pick at the start of the game. I chose the origin of the Adarian scholar, so in conversations throughout the game, I got extra dialogue options that had my wisdom as a scholar showcased, though it didn't really affect many conversations in ways that made a huge difference. You just say a couple extra lines, and using these dialogue options doesn't give you any experience as well. While your character attributes affected your stats in general, not having dialogue options due to low attributes doesn't really affect the flow of the main story at all. Let's take Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 for example. I'm still going through that game, but skill checks and dialogue options due to having different attributes really changed the course of certain missions in drastic ways, and you had many ways to complete missions. So coming from that game and being thrown into this one was a little bit of a letdown. Your companions are a varied bunch. You got Kai, Marius, Giada, and Yatsli. Each of them have unique character stories, side missions, and camp conversations that allow you to learn more about them. I enjoyed these conversations, and it added a lot to my enjoyment of the story. Some of the major story choices affect how your companions view you, and there's a chance they'll even abandon you if you make the wrong decisions. Overall, the companions were one of my favorite aspects of the game. While the main cast of companions are great, the NPCs in Avowed can be hit or miss. Some are memorable, but many feel lifeless, lacking the extra layer of personality that would make them feel truly alive. For a game so focused on story and character, I was expecting more depth from the NPCs outside of your main party and the story. Now, one of the best parts of Avowed is the character creation. You get to pick your background, which influences dialogue options, quests, and your character's abilities. But for those expecting a deep relation system, this game might disappoint. While companions do have personal quests and great dialogue, the lack of romantic or deep personal interactions can be a bit disappointing. One thing I did get annoyed about in the game is how cryptic it can be at times, especially one character who talks to you in your mind. This character, due to story spoilers, I won't mention their name, but every time they spoke in the game, it was just cryptic nonsense half the time. If this was a short game, that'd be fine, but over the course of 20 hours, which is how long the story can actually take, it somewhat wears you down. Since I don't know much about the Pillars of Eternity games and its story, I might not have the same enjoyment or dissatisfaction with the story that others might have who are well versed in this universe. But as a casual player, I kept progressing my game for the story and was curious to see how it ended. Let's move on to the gameplay, which is a mixed bag for me. This is where I had the most issues with the game, especially during the first 4 to 5 hours. Combat, which is a major aspect of the game, can feel repetitive and boring in the beginning. You have the option to play in both first-person and third-person perspectives. Personally, I went with third-person as the game throws a ton of enemies at you all the time, and third-person helps keep track of the action a lot more easier than the first-person. Combat is dynamic and offers a lot of customization, whether you prefer spellcasting, swordplay, or range combat. There's something for everyone. Weapons include swords, maces, spears, guns, wands, and more. But I have to admit, the variety of enemies feels a bit limited at times. It doesn't quite match the diversity of the world, and that can make combat feel repetitive. Especially early in the game when you don't have many abilities and your companions are largely useless. You're given 2 weapon sets to use, and you can mix and match weapons like dual swords, sword and mace, or even mace and grimoire. It's a cool feature, but as I mentioned, combat feels somewhat simplistic after the initial hours. Enemy variety also leaves a lot to be desired, especially when it comes to the bosses, who are mostly humans or larger versions of enemies you fight regularly, like spiders, beetles, large amphibians, lizards, etc. I was hoping for more exciting fantasy creatures like dragons or giant bees, but no such luck in this game. The world of Avowed is expansive, and Obsidian does a fantastic job of creating detailed, immersive environments. The balance between mystery and danger is spot on, and you'll find yourself getting lost in forests, caves, and towns while uncovering the lore. Loot is another highlight. You can find all sorts of gear with varying qualities by looting chests, completing quests, and defeating enemies. The best type of loot are unique items which have extra abilities and attributes. An example would be a gold-tiered gun, which can be upgraded to have abilities like shock accumulation, extra stunning, shots bouncing off enemies, etc. After the first 4 to 5 hours, you start getting a lot of uniques by exploring the world, which keeps the player satisfied and helps with wanting to explore the world more. A constant stream of proper loot and rewards is well appreciated. I played the game on PC with an RTX 3090, and while the game ran fine for the most part, I did notice a lot of frame rate drops in densely populated areas, even with DLSS enabled. I also experienced a fair number of crashes early in the game, which is frustrating, but interestingly enough, these kind of stop happening after about 30 hours of play. Hopefully, future updates will address these performance issues. The game does have some great visuals, solid production quality, and great audio design. I do, however, have to mention the laughable running animation of the main character in third-person mode. It's just kind of wonky and kind of takes you out of the immersion. As for replayability, there's plenty of value here. I spent over 40 hours on my first playthrough doing a lot of side content and main missions, and I could easily go back for a second run trying different choices or approaches in the main story. So there's definitely a lot of content to sink your teeth into. Overall, Avowed is a polished RPG with great world building, solid combat, and a decent story. However, it does have its flaws. Limited enemy variety, shallow NPC interactions, and a bit of slow progression early on. But if you're a fan of Obsidian's previous titles or fantasy RPGs in general, there's a lot to enjoy here. It's not going to change the face of gaming, but with plenty of content and a solid experience, it's hard not to recommend, especially if you have Game Pass. For me, this is an above average game, and it sits between a 7 and an 8 out of 10. And that's it for my review. I hope you guys found it helpful and informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.